And now I put on my hat as the introducer for our speaker today, Marlene Neill, Ph.D., APR, fellow PRSA, is a professor and graduate program director at Baylor University in Texas, where she teaches courses in public relations and advertising. Her research interests include public relations management and ethics, which is where the ethics part was where I got to know her so many years ago. She's published more than 30 journal articles, co-authored 3 books on public relations and ethics. She has also leadership development and women in leadership, which is a very interesting book. She's a longtime member of the Central Texas chapter of the PRSA. She served as chair for the Southwest District PRSA in 2011 and the chair of the PRSA Educators Academy in 2021. She's laughing in the back here. It's, you get yourself introduced like this, but so minutely, but she has such an interesting background. At the national level, she served on the Universal Accreditation Board, the AUAB, and the PRSA Board of Ethics and Professional Standards. She also is a member of the Arthur W. Page Society and serves on the board of lead advisors to the Planck Center for Public Relations Leadership. She received her Ph.D. in advertising from the University of Texas in Austin, her Master's of Art degree in journalism from the University of Missouri, and at Columbia, rather, and her Bachelor of Science degree in journalism from the University of Kansas. On top of all of that, she actually worked in the private sector for 12 years in nonprofit and government public relations. So she has on-the-ground experience as well as all of this research that she's done. Just a word about what you're going to hear today. This is some of the most interesting research I've ever come across. And I urge you to pay attention to it because especially certain elements of it are so interesting. And she'll talk about these and has examples to show you, but this is a roadmap for us as a society. She talks about and finds out what are the ethical barriers that we face in our practice? What are our aspirations in ethics? She has some interesting news about that too, but I want you to think about this as being a roadmap for the future for PRSA. We have to get more effective in this area within ourselves first, and then in the wider world. We have a lot to offer. The world needs us, Lord knows. I really believe that once, you know, which I guess is a personal, once things sort themselves out after November, no matter how they go, we have a lot of rebuilding to do in this country, and we can play a major role in getting that done, it seems to me. So without further ado, Professor Neill.
Thank you all so much. And they've asked me to stay a little bit closer to the laptop because they're recording it for be able to use later on. So please excuse the fact that I'm going to stay very still for that purpose. But thank you all so much for being here. And thank you so much, Jim, for inviting me. And congratulations on your award. I couldn't be happier for you. So we're going to be talking about ethics skills today. And this is based on some research that I did for the Arthur W. Page Center out of Penn State University. It's not completely advanced. There we go. Okay. So the things that we'll be focusing on this morning are discovering what are the essential ethics skills that are necessary in public relations today. And that's going to be based on feedback from survey research as well as qualitative research with practitioners. I'm also going to encourage you to assess your own mastery of these core ethics skills. We actually did a survey with your members prior to this event, and I'm going to be sharing some of those results with you.
We want to make sure that they can hear you.
So I need to hold it. Okay, I had it on, but okay, thank you. I'll hold it a little closer. Okay, so we're going to be talking about mastery of those skills and have you think about your own mastery of them. And then we're going to be talking about the resources that are available for you in any areas where you might feel a bit weaker or your team members need some additional training. And then we're going to hopefully at the end have some time where you can apply some of these resources to some specific scenarios. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some original research that I did for the Arthur W. Page Center that was published in the Journal of Media Ethics. The title of the article is The State of Ethics Competencies, Training and Moral Efficacy in Public Relations. So some background on this, back in 2017, that is, there was a report done just before the pandemic that was published by the Commission on Public Relations Education. And in response to that, the Page Center reached out to me and said, we need to do some research to see what's going on here. So in the most recent report that came out in 2023, they found that ethics was ranked third among the most desired knowledge, skills, and abilities for entry-level practitioners. The others, of course, being related to writing and communication skills, as you would expect. However, practitioners also indicated that entry-level practitioners are not meeting their expectations when it comes to ethics knowledge, giving them a 3.03 score on average out of 5. So kind of neutral as far as how much they feel like they've mastered these ethics knowledge and skills. Unfortunately, these findings are consistent with the 2017 report, which is when the Page Center first reached out to me to conduct research for them about this topic. And in fact, it looks like progress is not being made. In fact, we might even be going backwards when it comes to our progress, because in the 2017 report, the average score that they gave young professionals when it came to their mastery of ethics knowledge was 3.61. Compare that to the 3.03 in this latest report. And so definitely concerning when it comes to whether or not our young professionals are adequately prepared to provide ethics counseling. So this particular study, the research questions that I looked at the first time around were, what do public relations and communication practitioners consider to be the most essential ethics competencies? And then in this latest study, I was looking at how confident they are regarding their own mastery of these competencies. And then how do they assess their colleagues in the industry in general when it comes to mastery of these same ethics skills and competencies? And then two, how prepared do they perceive they are to actually provide counsel on ethical issues? And then what are the most common ethical issues that they're facing? So we'll be sharing some insights from both qualitative and survey research in these areas. So for this particular study, the most recent one that I published in 2023, I was able to conduct a survey with 314 public relations and communication professionals. And the participants were recruited by Qualtrics, and we did include communication professionals in general, and it was not just limited to PRSA. So we're looking the industry more broadly with this particular survey. You'll see that 210 of the participants were women and 99 were men, so breakdown of 67 and almost 32%. And then 57.6 identified as white. So actually this sample was a little bit more diverse than the industry is itself, because a lot of times the industry tends to be 70 to 80% white. And this was a little bit younger sample. The average age was 36, ranging from an average of 9 years, anywhere from 1 to 35 years, 1 year of experience up to 35 years of experience, with an average of 9 years of experience. Also in this particular survey, I wanted to get a sense of whether or not they had different credentials like the APR. And you'll see that I actually extended a little bit beyond that to see some of the credentials that are offered now by the IABC. And so the most common credential they had was the Communication Management Professional, the CMP, followed by the Strategic Communication Management Professional credential. And then, of course, some had more than one credential. That would be the case with the fellows. There were 52 fellows, and then 42 that had the APR, and then 41 that had the APR plus M. And then, even though the credential is no longer offered anymore, 38 had the ABC. And some of them, as I mentioned, that had the APR, of course, would have been the fellows would have already had the APR as well. So some had more than one credential. And this is significant because both the credentials offered through IBC as well as PRSA test have content on their exams related to ethics and law. So the prior study that I did that was qualitative, I used the Delphi method, and I don't know if you're all are familiar with what that is, but it's an open-ended survey that you use with open-ended responses. I asked just 3 questions. What are the essential ethics skills that you believe are needed? What kind of ethical issues are you facing, and which of those ethical competencies do you feel like are missing? And had open-ended blanks for them to respond with 5 responses for each of those questions. And so for the first round, I had 29 leaders who completed that first survey, and then the follow-up round. So with Delphi, you actually go to the same people over and over again until you have consensus. So I went back to the group, had narrowed those items down a little bit, and had them rank them in priority. And so for the first round, the breakdown was 14 women, 7 men, and 1 person that designated other. And then the second round, it was 17 women and 7 men. They had an average of Age was 55, 57, and then average years of experience range anywhere from 28 to 29 and a half years. So a very senior group of professionals that gave me feedback to these questions. So for that first question related to what are the most common ethical issues that they were facing, again, I had like 5 blanks for them. That resulted in 119 responses, 120 to the question about what are the essential ethics competencies that are necessary in public relations, and then 82 responses related to what they felt was lacking related to those competencies. So then looking for similar wording, I was able to narrow that first list of ethical issues down to like 20 that were similar in wording, 25 for the skills, and then 20 for those skills that were lacking. I then had them rank them in priority and was able to then generate a top 10 list. I did have them, gave them opportunity to enter any additional competencies they felt like were missing, and I didn't get very many responses, so we pretty much stuck to those initial lists. So this is what resulted from that Delphi survey that the Delphi questionnaire that then resulted in the instrument that I used for the survey at this phase. So the top 10 essential ethics competencies that resulted from that qualitative research, some of the common wording was around having a personal code of ethics or value system. And you'll see that those I combined together. Some of these you might have chosen to separate, but I was looking for a way to make it simple and come up with a top 10 list. The second one, the language was used around personal behavior, integrity, accountability, and trustworthiness. The third had to do with awareness of knowledge of codes of ethics and being able to actually identify ethical issues. Then you'll see some wording around critical thinking or problem solving. That's emphasized very heavily in the new CPRE report. And then this next one you'll see is actually kind of significant. I combine these together, but you'll see that sometimes words have different meanings for people. And so honesty, transparency, truthfulness, candor, I combined them together, but you'll see the term candor has a little bit different connotation, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Number 6, no surprise, courage and ability to speak truth to power. And then we saw that some of the skills that are needed in public relations generally also are perceived to be essential when it comes to ethics counseling, things like strategic planning, judgment, counseling abilities, and then leadership. So then I asked which of those skills were lacking. Number 1, and I feel like this is no surprise, is courage, that confidence to speak up. And we'll be talking more about that one today. The second had to do with ethical awareness. The third related to judgment or critical thinking. Then leadership, their own personal behavior and accountability. Transparency, having a moral compass or values-based decision-making, conflicts of interest, strategic planning, and then respect for others. So those were the skills that they felt like were lacking. So I'm going to give a little bit of some background from an academic standpoint, but I think it is relevant to our discussion today. This first concept I saw in a brand new article that came out, and they referenced this idea of moral ownership, and you also can bring in autonomy to that because I think that's also important. But moral ownership has to do with a sense of responsibility relative to the situation. So they feel like they have a responsibility to do something about the issue that they're confronting. But then 2, they do have to have some level of autonomy, the ability to actually make an informed, uncoerced decision. Then you have this idea of moral courage. We saw that appeared on the list, both of skills that are necessary and those that are lacking. But it involves their fortitude to convert moral intention into actions despite pressures from either inside or outside of the organization to do otherwise. And then prior to that, you actually have to have confidence in your abilities. That's the moral efficacy that we're talking about, and why it's important to have an understanding of what their skills are, where they feel that they're strong, and where they feel like their weaknesses are, because you have to have confidence in your abilities in order to then have that courage to speak up. So this is the chart, and this is really interesting to take a look at. We'll actually look at the results of your own survey that you did with your chapter and how it compares to this particular chart. But again, this was a pretty young sample, average of 9 years of experience among the sample that I did the national survey with. But you'll see that the green line, which is the competencies that they feel are essential, really parallels well with their own self-assessment. So the skills that they felt like were necessary, they tended to rate themselves quite high on. And it's going to be interesting as we look a little bit further at some of the other charts. But you will see that big dip in the middle. And in case you're wondering what that is, my students provided the insight on this, and I probably will see some others nod in the room about what's going on with candor. Apparently in the movie Divergent in pop culture, the word candor has a very negative connotation. So initially, remember that I had combined with transparency, honesty. It's a reminder for those of us doing research that you have to think about some of the connotative meanings that people have with different words. And so while a lot of the scholars in ethics like the term candor, our population did not. They rejected it. And so that's why you see that big dip there. What's also interesting about this chart is you see that yellow line. That's how they rate our profession in general. And I think that's important for us to pay attention to, because that's what they see as the gaps when it comes to knowledge and knowledge, skills, and abilities related to ethics. And so there's a pretty big gap there with all of the skills. And in case you can't read it on the slides, I'll kind of go across here for you. So the first one was that personal code of ethics. And you'll remember these all come from that research I did, the qualitative research, the Delphi study. And then integrity, being able to identify issues, critical thinking, candor, courage, strategy, judgment, counseling, and then leadership. And you'll see that for the most part, they scored themselves quite high. You had a little bit lower dip there related to strategy and judgment. But for the most part, as we would say, the practitioners thought very highly of themselves when evaluating their ethics skills. Also, from the CPRE report that just came out, I think this is important to see. So again, you'll see once we change that word back to honesty from candor for that phase of the study, the importance as far as being essential went back up. So that term candor did have some negative connotations there. And then you'll see that as far as strategy, it was scored a little bit lower, and then leadership was scored lower. And again, this is looking at it from the perspective of what's essential for young professionals, so they may not expect quite as much related to that. But when it came to mastery, the orange line, you'll see there was a significant gap between what they feel like is essential and where they would score young professionals, beginning professionals' skills when it comes to ethics. So for those of us who are educators or mentors to young professionals, we can look at that and see, yes, there's some work that we need to do in helping young professionals improve their skills around ethics. There were a couple more that were added to this chart for the CPRE study. They added the scores of ethical listening and ethical business practices. And you'll see that both of those scored pretty highly as being essential. Now, this goes back to the research that I did, and I think it's quite telling. So the green line represents young professionals' assessment of their skills. The orange line represents mid-career professionals' assessment of their skills. And then the red, interesting enough, represents the senior professionals. And you'll see that senior pros actually rank themselves quite modestly when it came to their assessment of skills. They ranked themselves very high on integrity, but they actually were very modest in the way that they scored themselves and among the other skills. And young professionals on many of the skills rated themselves the highest or very close to mid-professionals. And so I think this is also quite interesting to see, because as those of us who are more senior might say, they don't realize what they don't know yet. And those of us who are instructors have to also bring that to light for our students to help them realize that they do have more learning to do. Even though they've learned a lot in the classroom, there's still a lot they need to learn when it comes to ethics. So I actually kind of find this graphic quite interesting. But I do feel like maybe what's going on with the senior professionals is maybe they've realized some of their limitations based on their experiences. But it's kind of an interesting chart to look at from that perspective. I also looked at it from the perspective of those who have certification, the credentials offered through the IABC as well as the APR. And you'll see on many of the skills, they rate themselves higher and have more confidence in their abilities having gone through the APR process or the other credentials that are offered by similar organizations. Through some statistical testing, I found that actually those who are APRs or are certified actually engage in ethics counseling more frequently than those who do not have those certifications. So the question was, in my job, I counsel management on ethical decisions, never, which would be a 1, 2 infrequently, 3 sometimes, 4 pretty often, and 5 very often. And the average scores ended up being a 3.62, so that sometimes to pretty often for those who were certified or had accreditation. And then it was 2.72, so the more towards the infrequently and sometimes for those who did not have that certification. Then looking at it again from this perspective, feeling well prepared to engage in ethics counseling. Those who were accredited or certified had an average score of 3.75 on a 5-point scale, and that was statistically significant, as well as that question, like I said, of whether or not they're engaging in ethics counseling, that being 3.62 to 2.72 for those who are not certified. So a very significant difference, statistically significant, in fact, when it came to their confidence and actually how frequently they were engaging in ethics counseling. And I know this is one of Jim's favorites parts from the study, and this had to do with what are the ethical issues they're actually facing in the industry. And this was the survey research that I did. You'll see number one, and this is reported by frequency, conflicts of interest, followed by transparency issues, disclosure or selective truth telling, then confidentiality, and then verifying facts of information. And tied with that was no consequences for unethical behavior. On the bottom of the list, it's interesting that even though we didn't have a lot of the responses, as many I should say, there's still a significant number of people facing these issues. And so we have some things related to executive behavior and misconduct and sexual harassment. And we actually found that both of those were happening more frequently than we would like to see. And in fact, I'm going to advance here and let you see from, and it's a little bit harder to read. I tried to zero in as much as I could on it, but you'll see that with young professionals, specifically related to hostile work environment, it was like 39%. And then around no consequences for ethical behavior, that was 35%. And then for all practitioners, then no consequences for unethical behavior was around 45%, and around trying to a little bit harder to read on the screen, but over 30% that were facing issues related to a hostile work environment and sexual harassment. So pretty significant numbers, even though those were less frequently. The most common issues, again, for those in across the industry, based on the CPR report, were around transparency. That was around 69%. So still interesting to see what kind of issues are being faced by the industry in general. And that was a more senior sample. Their survey was skewed a little bit more senior than the one that I did. All right, I did want to introduce you to some resources that I've shared through some of my publications for those who are looking to enhance their ethics skills. And of course, we're going to make these slides available for those slides that might have been a little bit more difficult to read. But that very first one, the personal code of conduct and value system, of course, I would point everyone to the PRSA codes of ethics, as well as the Global Alliance Code of Ethics, and then recommend that young professionals routinely review industry and their own employers' codes of ethics as a way to become more aware of ethical issues. And then as far as integrity, reviewing their own organization's codes of ethics. And then also I recommend that they begin to recruit some ethical mentors that can provide counseling. In order to be able to identify ethical issues, I point them to the Page Center ethics training modules that are available for free through the Arthur W. Page Center's website. I'm a big fan of a new resource, the Media Ethics Initiative through the University of Texas at Austin. They have a lot of different videos and scenarios, case studies that you can work through. And then the PRSA Board of Ethics Ethical Standards Advisories, many of those that Jim himself has written over the years. And then they also regularly apply decision models to ethics scenarios and actually engage in ethics training drills. We do that for crisis communications. We should also be doing that for ethics. For critical thinking, again, the media ethics initiatives are great for that. And I'm a big fan of some resources through the Giving Voice to Values curriculum. There's a whole series of books and case studies. In fact, I use a lot of those in my class. Discussion with mentors regarding ethical issues they face. It would be valuable for young professionals, as well as participating in webinars and other professional development opportunities. For strategic planning, there's a free resource, the APR study guide. And then I would point them to some decision models that I'm going to be sharing with you today. There should be a handout somewhere that I'm going to be using in a moment related to that. And then as far as judgment, I found a resource called the Ethical Reasoning Value Rubric from the American Association of Colleges and Universities. And again, pointing them back to seeking counsel from their mentors and peers for judgment. For counseling, I've got a book over here, Public Relations Ethics, How to Speak Up and Keep Your Job. It was a book I authored with Amy Barnes a few years ago, and I will be sharing some resources from that today, but we have a lot of information about different influence tactics that you can use. And then again, that Giving Voice to Values curriculum that I referenced. And then also I think that young professionals can learn from observing leaders in their own organization, both good and bad behavior from that observation. For leadership, there's a book by Bruce Berger and Joanne Ming called Public Relations Leaders as Sense Makers that I'm a fan of. And then there was a book I also published with Dr. Ming related to PR women with influence, breaking through the ethical and leadership challenges. I also recommend that young professionals gain some leadership experience through service with nonprofit organizations. They can definitely do that through PRSA, but other organizations as well. That's how a lot of professionals have gotten experience in leadership early on in their careers, is through service with nonprofit organizations. For candor, honesty, and transparency, again, refer you to the book I did with Amy Barnes. And then also, again, recommending that they seek that counsel through their mentors. For courage, I came across a great resource through the Plank Center that's available on their website for free called Cracking the Code to Workplace Confidence. And then again, referring them back to being able to recruit and maintain relationships with those ethical mentors that I referenced earlier. So this is the result from your own survey with your own chapter related to competencies. So the red line is the skills that you feel like are essential, with the exception of strategy and counseling abilities. Everything scored pretty highly. A lot of the skills you all gave a 5 on a 5-point scale is perceiving that they were essential. Then the green line, interestingly enough, was the self-mastery. So you do see a gap with some of your chapter members about whether or not they feel like they've mastered some of these essential skills. And I think that would be great guidance for your chapter about maybe future programming that you might want to do to address some of those skills. And then what's interesting is that lowest line, the purple one, is how they rank our profession in general as far as mastery of these skills. So you definitely see a huge gap between what they believe, what you all believe are essential skills, and where you perceive our profession is when it comes to mastering those. The other question I had for you all that they administered in the pre-event questionnaire was related to the ethical skills that you're facing. There's 19 of you who responded, and you'll see that the most common response was around verifying facts and information, around transparency and executive misbehavior and misconduct. And those ranged anywhere from 15 to 14 of you out of 19 that said you would face that. And then you'll see that even the lowest one, maybe about 5 of you had faced honesty or pressure, issues around honesty or pressure to lie. Violation of company organization's core values was around 6. No consequences for unethical behavior was around 9. And even sexual harassment was around 9 out of 19. So some really interesting insights from the chapter survey that was administered. I'm now going to shift to discussions about how to actually engage in ethics counseling in practice. So as I mentioned, I'm a big fan of this resource called Giving Voice to Values. There's a whole series of books and case studies that are available. I was introduced to it several years ago when I was a graduate student at the University of Texas. But I like it because they really focus on not just identifying the ethical issue at hand and what is the right thing to do, but how to actually develop an action plan. And so some of the things they want you to do along the way is to identify reasons and rationalizations that could prevent you as well as others from acting ethically. Thinking through who are the stakeholders and what is at stake for each of those groups. And then the last question is very important. That has to do with how can you give voice to your values and exercise moral imagination? What should you do? What are your most powerful and persuasive arguments? And how can you influence those who disagree with you? So I'm going to introduce you to several different persuasive techniques that are used by senior practitioners that I've interviewed over the years. So based on the Giving Voice to Values work, there's a discussion about some basics about behavioral ethics in general that are quite informative. And so they point out that most people make their decisions instinctively rather than rationally. So we don't always think through very fully our decisions when it comes to ethics. We tend to believe that we are leading ethical lives while doing things that ethical people would not do. Cognitive limitations, social and organizational pressures, as well as situational factors make it hard for even the most well-intentioned people to act as ethically as they would like to do. And so they point out that most of our decisions, including those around ethics, are made intuitively. While this innate moral sense often gets it right, as when people get a bad feeling in their gut when they are about to behave unethically, we often can get it wrong. People must understand other factors that can wreak havoc on decision making, like cognitive errors, social and organizational factors, as well as situational factors. So some great things to think about going into this discussion. And they give us a sense of some of the rationalizations that come into play. So self-serving bias, where we tend to only seek out information that confirms what we want to do and reject that doesn't fit in. And then overconfidence, a tendency to believe that we are more ethical than we are, which inclines us to make decisions without serious ethical, with serious implications without a lot of reflection. There's some work by Jones that has actually come up with 4 steps that we engage in when making ethical decisions. The first is moral awareness. So first of all, we have to become aware that there is an ethical issue at place. And then we actually then have to make a moral decision. Following that, we then have to intend to do what is right. And then hopefully that will result in moral action. One of my favorite decision models that I use in my classes is box model, and there's just 3 steps. So I like this one. It's very easy to remember, and so you don't necessarily have to have your notes in front of you to remember the steps. And I tell my students the second step actually has 2 components to it. So the first one's pretty easy to think about, and that's consulting your own conscience about the rightness of an action. So how do you personally feel about it? The second one then involves 2 components. One is seeking expert advice, but the reason you're doing so is to identify ethical alternatives. So you could seek advice from a trusted mentor. You could go to the code of ethics. If it was an issue related to the environment, you may speak to some kind of scientist or expert in that area. You could go to a trusted colleague. There's a lot of different people that you could go to or resources, but the reason for doing so is to identify ethical alternatives. And then the third step is to conduct a public discussion with the parties involved. And that can be done hypothetically, but it involves putting yourselves in the shoes of others who are going to be impacted by your decision and thinking through their perspective. So you go through all 3 steps and then you would make your decision. The other model that's used a lot, that I use a lot in my class, and it has to do around persuasive communication in general, is the TERRS test. The T stands for truthfulness of your message. The A stands for authenticity of the persuader. R, respect for the persuadee, your audience that you're targeting your message to, the equity of your appeal, and then social responsibility. And as you seek out the original resource from Baker and Martinson, they have very specific questions that you can ask yourself around each of those questions. And then Fitzpatrick model, this is by Kathy Fitzpatrick, who served on the Board of Ethics and Professional Standards with Jim many years ago when they revised the PRSA Code of Ethics. And this is her model. You define the specific ethical issue or conflict, identify factors that may influence your decision, identify key values, the parties who will be affected by the decision, so very similar to the box model with that particular step, and then select ethical principles to guide your decision making, and then you make your decision and justify it. I'm now going to shift to talking about the different persuasive approaches that you can use, and then I'll be actually sharing some quotes from some senior professionals about how they've actually used these in practice. So the first ones are rational approaches that can include the use of case studies, so finding examples similar to the issue that your organization is facing and looking for some lessons from how they handle those situations. You can also conduct research to find facts and figures to back up your recommendations, and legitimacy appeals. This is a term that I was introduced to when I was working on one of the earlier projects, but it has to do what is right and lawful and consistent with the organization's core values. The relational approaches include recruiting allies and coalition members. I actually caution my students that this is a more advanced approach, and I have a separate lecture that I do on that particular topic because it does involve a lot of internal politics, and so you have to be careful once you engage in ally building and coalition building. And then the last one is a great approach for anyone at any level, and that's just asking questions and listening and engaging in dialogue to see where the other person is coming from so that you can tailor your response to what you learn about their reasoning behind the decision they're about to make. Other approaches, citing personal experiences. This is one that tends to be used by a lot of senior professionals who have a lot of experiences that they can draw from. Pressure, I found that actually that has to do with being persistent and assertive, and I found that one is actually used a lot in connection with allies and coalitions. Those two tend to go together very well. Emotional appeals, you'll see that women in particular do not like to use emotional appeals because of some stereotypes. I'll touch more on that in a moment. And then there is the political acceptable role of serving as a devil's advocate, and that's an approach that you can take. The direct approach is just like it sounds, just coming out and saying this is not right. Men were more likely to use this approach than women because some of them have been reprimanded for doing so. Use of scenarios, alternatives, and solutions. the headline test, which has your colleagues think about the media implications of a decision. And then, of course, you can use internal reporting systems as well. So I've got some specific quotes describing using these in actual practice. So as far as listening and dialogue, the person, this is a PRSA fellow, said, it's engaging in dialogue. You have to start by asking the person first, what do you think, or where do you want to go? Where do you want to be, or what is it that's bothering you? So you get a baseline, and then you understand the differences between yourself and that person or management, and you know what you have to bridge. So it gives you a work plan as to how to get to a successful point. And then personal experiences in the context of storytelling. I always like to say, well, in my experience, let me tell you a story about this. And you would think this wouldn't be a big deal, but let me tell you how it escalated and what we had to do to correct it. So yeah, whenever possible, personal stories are hugely impactful when it comes to persuasion. And this is someone describing using the legitimacy appeals. I've used mission, vision, those points in discussions where I'll say, okay, if we do X, Y, Z, I don't think that it's keeping a mission. It's in keeping with our mission, vision, and values. I think that those statements that a company has already adopted can be extremely effective and oftentimes more effective than saying, I just don't think that's ethical. If you can say that our value is to always be transparent, and does this really tie back to those values? I think it's an even stronger statement because you're tying it back to something that a company has already decided that they believe in. And then case studies, this is a person who would often write his own and then reference them to that to help them be able to see how they might learn from a particular situation. And this other person describes how instead of actually telling them what the case study means, let them read it and then hopefully they would then come away with the right conclusion. So it's kind of a more indirect a way of using case studies. And then allies and coalitions. I think when you have more than one person saying the same thing, it's helpful. So it wasn't like I had to really recruit them. I just had to make them aware of what was happening. And so I think going in force can help your case. Sometimes it can backfire, if somebody wants to kill the messenger. But most of the time, if you hear something from one person, you think, yeah, that might be true. But if several people come to you with the same messaging, I think you take notice. And the headline test, this again has to do with having them think about the media consequences of a decision. What's the good story that you can imagine and the bad story that you can imagine? I don't have to explain it there for them. They can sit there and think about it. It could go this way. Is that the headline? So thinking about the media consequences of a decision. So mistakes to avoid, and I like to bring this in, even if I know I've got quite a few senior folks in the room, even if this is not something you would do, junior members of your team need to be cautioned about these things. So as far as the direct approach, I did give a cautionary note about that earlier. You don't want to tell them that they're wrong. You want to give them the advice in a way that they can handle it. So you have to sort of nuance it. And this female PRSA fellow said, she made the mistake of being very direct with someone and they took that as an affront and took it negatively, which I was shocked about because I'd always been able to be very forthright and honest in my counsel. I was reprimanded for being so forthright, so I did not do it that way anymore. So I did find that the direct approach was used much more by men than by women. Emotional appeals, again, cautionary note. I try to avoid emotional appeals primarily because of sensitivity to being a woman in leadership position and the stigma about women being emotional in the workplace. And I probably erred in the other direction, but I never wanted to appear emotional about a discussion or base it on feelings. And I also heard the same thing from men about a reluctance to use emotional appeals unless you were using it about the emotions of stakeholders. And that seemed to be considered a much more socially acceptable thing to do. Issuing ultimatums. So I have to set this one up so you understand what's going on here. This was one of my very first studies that I ever did as a PhD student. And I thought, what direction is this study going to go? Because I had a couple of people talk about someone in their office having extramarital affairs or office affairs. And so this is someone who actually walked in on an office affair. And you can understand now why this person had such a strong response. So the mistake is issuing ultimatums. He said, you're risking the reputation of all of us with this behavior. And if you don't tell our boss, I'm going to tell our boss. I drew that line in the sand and I regret it. I started with an ultimatum instead of ended with an ultimatum. But you can understand under those circumstances why someone would have had such a strong response. But he wished he would not have issued an ultimatum if he would have given himself a little bit more negotiation room on how he handled that situation. And then timing. This is a great lesson again for the younger members on your team. You learn that there are ways to push back. You might not want to confront a senior executive when he's surrounded by a bunch of his peers, but just circle back after the meeting or go see him before the meeting to say, I'm going to raise this. Will you help me or will you chime in? or I don't want you to, or I want you to be aware of it. So you don't put yourself in a confrontation where the guy's got to save face by firing you. So again, that shows that sensitivity about when you're counseling someone who may outrank you, that you have to be very careful about how you approach that. And that's why we have these various techniques that we're recommending that you use. Again, no group emails. So this did happen. I had a gal who pushed back on a top executive of the company that bought us, and he wanted to get her fired immediately. Who is this person? And I had to say, no, that's one of my best people. And he was like, how dare her? So again, you have to be careful about how you confront people and that you don't publicly embarrass them when you're raising these issues. And then there's definitely some issues around silence. I just have a new survey that is in progress now, some research that I'm doing. This was a national survey with 257 communication professionals working specifically in communication agencies and firms. And when asked if they had ever chosen to remain silent regarding an ethical issue, almost 37% said yes. And when given a checklist, these are the most common responses: fear of losing their job, it wouldn't make a difference, didn't have enough information or evidence, they considered it wasn't a major issue, they weren't a part of the decision team, and also pressure from friends and colleagues. So it does give us a sense of why that courage is so important when it comes to ethics counseling. And when asked if they'd faced any consequences, almost 32% reported yes. And the most common responses were that they've been treated harshly by colleagues. There was a loss of influence, pay cuts, loss of jobs. They'd either quit or resigned, or they've been demoted. And I do want to, at this point, talk a little bit about this idea of moral intensity. So on every little situation, you're not going to say, either you do this or I'm going to quit my job. And I'll get into what moral intensity is in a moment. But as someone in a previous study said, you have to pick your battles carefully over some minor thing. You don't want to fall on your sword. But the major ethical things, you literally have to take a stand and draw a line in the sand. Like I said, you have to be prepared to walk out. So the criteria associated with moral intensity, first of all, are the magnitude of the consequences. It has to do with the number of people that are going to be impacted by the decision, the social consensus that this is a bad thing, the probability effect that harm or benefit will occur, time. When there's less time pressure, the urgency to act is going to be, when there's less time pressure, that is, the urgency to act is going to be reduced, considering something that might be more timely. Proximity, how close you personally feel to the people who are going to be impacted by the decision, and the concentration of effect, the number of people that will be impacted. So these factors tend to come into play when deciding how strong of a stand to take. And of course, one of the stories that's often told within PRSA is that of Paula Padine, who was a U.S. veteran, and that was with the Phoenix hospital system, the wait time scandal. And people were definitely at risk of serious health issues and dying, and that's why that particular group, a number of them, decided to become whistleblowers. So you can definitely see how moral intensity came into play for that particular situation. But I've got a few quotes I want to wrap up with here before we go into the scenario. And this was a quote from someone who was in a very difficult situation. His company had been under investigation with the security and securities, I'm losing the term, SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission. There we go. I knew the acronym. He said, too many people focus on keeping their job, not doing it. In these situations, you can't be afraid. You can't be focused on keeping your job. You focus on doing it. And doing your job means being that voice of reason, having convictions, and telling the truth. And this was one of my favorite quotes of all time. I think it has to do with thinking about your own personal credibility. And has to be one of my favorites of all time. I can't afford to lose my credibility. As PR professionals, it's all that we have. And if I lose my credibility here, it's not like I can go start over with someone else somewhere else. Credibility is something that you can't afford to lose. And so just a reminder that when it comes to ethics counseling, it's about your own reputation as well, that you don't want to compromise it.